We are going to finish up the book of Revelation. This is session 6 of 6. So let me begin my PowerPoint presentation. If you've got questions, you're welcome to stop me simply by pushing down on the space bar and entering into the conversation, asking a question. Just know that I may end up deferring the question until later in the class. So I will sort of evaluate that. I think Shell is not muted. Okay, there he is. Okay. Okay, very good. We will begin with sharing the screen, and we are going to begin today's presentation with simply restating the title. The title is the Book of Revelation. Now, by now, you should know that my thesis is that this is a prophecy of hope, a message of hope, and not a prophecy of doom. But let's look at this particular passage, which is going to be Revelation 19:11 through the end of the book, which is 22:21. We're going to deal today primarily with the seventh, actually it's the last of the vision cycles, the last of the vision cycles, and this is an unnumbered vision cycle. We've seen that before. Some of the vision cycles are numbered, some are unnumbered, and with each we've seen a different act, the final drama of salvation enacted. In this particular vision cycle, we're going to see a tremendous emphasis on judgment before the triumph of God. So there's going to be an allusion to persecution, the first phase of our cycle, but primarily in this unnumbered vision cycle, we're going to see emphasis on judgment. And it's going to begin with the rider on the white horse in 1911. It'll be followed by the grisly banquet, followed by the final battle, followed by the binding of Satan, the beginning of chapter 20, the 1,000-year reign, and a few verses later, the judgment of the world, the last judgment, which takes place in 2011, and then the new heaven and new earth passage, which begins at the beginning of chapter 21. So there are the seven elements of this final unnumbered vision cycle. All of these initial ones are going to focus primarily on judgment, and then here is the victory of God, the triumph of God in the seventh element of this vision cycle. So let's go back and review just very quickly the central theological question of the book of Revelation. As I said, it's very easy to get caught up in the trees and never see the forest. So I want to keep reminding you of the forest. What's this book really trying to do? It's trying to answer the question of who is in charge. Who is in charge? Is it, in fact, Satan and the forces of evil? Or is God really in charge? And this is a question that is asked because it really looks like right now Satan is winning, because Christians are dying. They are suffering and dying. How is it that God, if we believe that God is in control, if God is over all things, how is it possible that Christians can be singled out for persecution and death? Does that mean that God is not in control? Satan appears to be winning the current battle. Who will win the war? That's really what the question of the book of Revelation, that's really the central theological question of the book of Revelation. As I've indicated, the answer that Revelation is going to give is a threefold answer. God is going to win the battle against the forces of evil in 3 stages. And those 3 stages are related to the 3-tiered universe that is the assumption of the book of Revelation and all other biblical authors. Again, I've talked about this, how it was believed in antiquity that the earth, a flat earth, was in the center of the world, that in fact heaven is above and the underworld is below. So you have these 3 tiers of existence. God's 3-tiered victory is going to be related, or 3-stage victory is going to be related to these 3 tiers. So as we have seen back in chapter 12, we saw that in fact Christ is raised from the dead and ascends to heaven. And when Christ ascends to heaven, war breaks out in heaven, and Satan and the forces of evil are defeated. And with that, the heavens are cleaned out. Satan and the forces of evil are thrown out of heaven, and they then end up on earth. And that's where Satan is for most of the book of Revelation, is on earth, going after Christians in particular. Well, we're going to see the stages 2 and 3 in this third cycle, in this vision cycle that we're going to see today. So let's look at the beginning of this vision cycle. Vision number 1 is the rider on the white horse. Then I saw heaven opened, and there was a white horse. Its rider is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes are like a flame of fire, and on his head are many diadems. He has a name inscribed that no one knows but himself. He is clothed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. Just like the B westerns that I used to love, anyone riding on a white horse was considered a good guy. And here it is. Jesus is going to be riding a good horse. How do I know this is Jesus riding the white horse? He's called Faithful and True. His name is called the Word of God. So this is a description of the parousia, that is the coming of Christ. Christ is now ready to return. So here is a vision of Christ in heaven getting ready to come to earth. And with him we find, as we continue reading this vision, with him are the armies of heaven. The armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. On his robe and on his thigh, he has a name inscribed, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So here is Jesus on this white horse ready to return, and with him, the armies of heaven. And the fact that they are wearing fine linen, white and pure, that has been the description of those martyrs who, in fact, were killed for the faith, those who are under the altar in heaven. So the armies of heaven who are going to come back with Jesus are those martyrs. The armies of heaven, wearing fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. So this is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He is ready to come back. Vision number 2, though, is a vision that in fact is out of order, because basically it is a vision that celebrates the defeat of the forces of evil. It's called the Grisly Feast. And after this battle is waged and the forces of evil lose, there are going to be bodies strewn everywhere. All of the people who are going to be defeated and killed because they have worshiped the beast, they have followed the false prophet and the like, all of them are going to be strewn on the battlefield. And so the next vision that we get is a vision of a grisly feast. So here the vultures of the air, the buzzards and the vultures and those other birds are going to come and clean up. They are invited to a feast. Unlike the marriage feast of the Lamb, which is a celebration of those who win, this grisly feast is a celebration of those who are defeated. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun with a loud voice. He called to all the birds that fly in mid-heaven, come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of the mighty, the flesh of horses and their riders, flesh of all, both free and slave, both small and great. Here is what is a prediction of the ultimate destruction of the forces of evil. So here, come and feast on all those who have fallen in battle. And then we get the actual battle. So now we're going to go back to the battle itself. And here is described, then I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered to make war against the rider on the horse and against his army. And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed in its presence the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshiped its image. These two were thrown into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. And the rest were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse, the sword that came from his mouth, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. So here is a description of the final battle. And the little detail that I think is so fascinating about this is that Jesus is with the armies of heaven. But notice that the armies of heaven do not fight. Even though they are there with Jesus, the armies of heaven don't fight. The rest were killed by the sword of the rider on the horse, the sword that came from his mouth, and all the birds were gorged with their feet, with their flesh. All the birds were gorged with their flesh. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And here is the case where it's going to be the rider on the horse who avenges those who have died, those who are martyred. But those who are martyred will witness the avenging of their deaths. They just won't participate in that act of vengeance. In the context of this battle, two important things are going to happen. The beast is going to be captured and the false prophet are going to be captured. And then after being captured, those two are going to be thrown alive into the lake of fire. They're not going to be killed. They're going to be captured and then thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. So if I have a little diagram here, just to remind you, we talked about the forces of evil. We saw back in chapter 12 that the dragon is Satan. And then at the beginning of chapter 13, we're introduced to two beasts. The beast, one of the beasts is Rome. The other beast is also called the false prophet. So Satan, the forces of evil and Satan, gives his power to the beast, which is Rome. And then the power or the authority of Rome is exercised by the false prophet. So here are the front people. The false prophet and the beast are ones who are agents of Satan and the forces of evil. And what happens to them according to the passage I just read? Well, the false prophet is going to be thrown into the lake of fire, and the beast is going to be thrown into the lake of fire. And that leaves only now Satan. Satan is now exposed. So after the front people are destroyed, now we can get at Satan. And that's what happens in vision 4. Satan is now going to be bound. This is at the beginning of Revelation chapter 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his right hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years and threw him into the pit, locked and sealed it over him so that he would deceive the nations no more until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that, he must be let out for a little while. Now Satan is bound. Satan is bound and put in the underworld. So if we look at our diagram again, now we have the second stage taken care of. We had Christ ascend, and when he ascended, war broke out in heaven. Satan was thrown down on earth. That is stage 1. So that's when heaven is cleaned out. Now we're going to clean out earth in stage 2. And that occurs when Christ returns with the parousia, the coming of Christ. Then Satan is going to be defeated on earth, and Satan will end up in the underworld. So now we have heaven cleaned out and earth cleaned out, and Satan is now bound in the underworld. Stage 2. But it also indicated, the passage I just read indicated that Satan is supposed to be let out for a time. So this isn't the end of Satan yet. We'll see the end of Satan in just a short bit. Okay, stage 2. So now we have 1,000-year reign. Then I saw thrones, and those seated on them were given authority to judge. I also saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God. They had not worshipped the beast or its image and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy are those who share in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power. They will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him 1,000 years. This is known as the millennial reign of Christ, the 1,000-year reign. The book of Revelation wants to say that those who, in fact, have died for the faith, those who are Christian martyrs, will be given the special reward of being able to reign with Christ 1,000 years. They will come to life and they will reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Now, we've seen that numbers in the book of Revelation are all symbolic, and we don't know, so we don't really know how long this reign will last. We don't know where this reign takes place. They're not very clear about that. But the author wants to say that those who die for the faith will be rewarded in a very special way. And that's what this passage is about. Those who are martyrs, those who die for their faith, will in fact be treated specially. They will reign with him for 1,000 years. That's not the general resurrection, when the rest of the dead will be raised. The rest of the dead will come to life after the 1,000-year period is ended. And we'll see that in just a minute. Okay, any questions about that? So that brings us to this next passage, Satan's demise. When 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, in order to gather them for battle. They are as numerous as the sands of the sea. They marched up over the breadth of the earth and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And a fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. So again, what I think is interesting about this passage is that you see clearly that Satan is being used by God. So when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan is going to come out of his underground prison for the very purpose of assembling all those who are evil on the earth. Like a magnet, Satan is going to attract evil for this final battle. And when he does attract all of this evil and they surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city, there is no battle that takes place. Fire comes down from heaven and consumes them all. All of them are gathered in a nice, convenient location so that they can all be killed at the same time. So Satan is used to attract all of the evil, to clean out all of the evil on earth. And then when he is done doing that, then he is disposed of, thrown into the lake of fire where the beast and the false prophet are. So we have, again, if we look at this diagram, we see stage 3. Satan is going to be expelled from the underworld. So we see that Satan is released from the pit. He's going to attract evil to him. And then Satan himself is going to be thrown into the lake of fire where the false prophet and the beast already are. So now we have heaven cleaned out, we have earth cleaned out, and we have the underworld cleaned out. And that brings us then to the moment of the last judgment, which is vision number 6 in this particular cycle. We've eliminated all the forces of evil. We got rid of the false prophet. He was thrown into the lake of fire. The beast thrown into the lake of fire. And now the dragon has been thrown into the lake of fire. So in light of that now, we can have the final judgment. And that's what the passage is starting here in 2011, the last judgment scene. Then I saw a great white throne, and the one who sat on it The earth and heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. And another book was opened, the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. This is what is called the general resurrection. This is what happens in the day of judgment. The dead are raised to life in order to be judged. Those who are found worthy are allowed to continue to live. Those who are found unworthy die a second time. That's called the second death. But this is the general resurrection. Everyone is brought back in order to be judged. The people that have already been judged worthy, those martyrs, are not a part of this. They've already been raised from the dead. These are people who are raised now from the dead who were not martyrs. In fact, all who have gone before are raised. And great and small, standing before the throne, books are opened, and another book is opened, the book of life. And all were judged according to their works, as recorded in the books. He goes on to talk about this second death. The sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. Because of the resurrection of the dead, all of the dead have been raised again. So now death has no more function. So death is going to die in light of the resurrection. And Hades, where people had been held, sort of the holding cell of the underworld, because it's been emptied out, there's no purpose for it either. So death and Hades are now thrown into the underworld, are now thrown into the lake of fire, along with those who are judged unworthy. That is the second death. So when death and Hades, the underworld, is thrown into the lake of fire, basically what you have now is life that is lived on two tiers. We've gotten rid of the underworld. We no longer have need for the underworld. The underworld has given up the dead that are in it. And so it too is going to be thrown into the lake of fire along with death itself. So now life is going to be lived on two planes, heaven and earth. And then comes the beginning of chapter 21. A new heaven and a new earth. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Then I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. The new Jerusalem is heaven coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her. So what you see in that particular image is that now life is going to be lived on a single plane of existence. We got rid of the underworld, and now we're going to have heaven descending to earth. And this is so important to understand in the biblical tradition. It is not the case that the Bible thinks that people are going to be sucked up into heaven. No, in fact, the movement of God has always been toward his people. God has always come to us. So we see in Genesis chapter 2, God gets down in the dust of the earth and creates Adam out of the dust of the ground, the Adamah. We see in Exodus chapter 20 that God comes down out of heaven on Mount Sinai to give the Ten Commandments and the law. We read in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The movement of God is always toward humanity. And that's what's so marvelous about this view here. It's not that we are going to be sucked up into heaven. In fact, heaven is going to come to us. God and his existence is going to come to where we are. Heaven is going to descend. The new Jerusalem is going to come to earth. So we see what's going to happen is that a loud voice from heaven saying, see, the home of God is among mortals. It's not, see, the home of mortals is with God. See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying, pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. Because of sin in humanity, God can't be with us, or he would destroy us. Now that sin has been dealt with and there is no more evil in the world, God can dwell among God's people at last. So the home of God is now among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people. God will be with them, and he will wipe every tear from their eyes, because the death will be no more. Mourning and crying, pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away. It's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful vision you get of what's to take place in the future, of heaven coming down, the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, and God dwelling among his people on a single plane of existence. Now, as much as I like this passage, I've told you that I worked with the translators of the New Revised Standard Version translation when I was in graduate school. And this is one of the passages where they really screwed up. I love what they did with many of the passages, but here is a place where they themselves actually realized after they had done it that they were wrong. They were trying to avoid masculine biased language in the translation. And so they tried to avoid, though, in avoiding masculine biased language, simply substituting person every time they saw the word man or men. Here they came to the home of God is among men, which is the traditional translation of this passage. And so to be more inclusive, they translated it, and to be less obtrusive, they translated it as mortals. See, the home of God is among mortals. Well, actually, at this point, there are no mortals. The ones who are around are now immortal. They aren't going to die. So that's a wrong translation. But you get the idea that the home of God is now among those who once were mortal. Now life is lived on a single plane of existence. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call right in the middle. Life is lived on a single plane of existence, God with his people living eternally. So there will be no more death. We go on to read in Revelation chapter 21. And the one who is seated on the throne says, see, I am making all things new. Also, he said, write this, for these words are trustworthy and true. Then he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty, I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. All those persons who have refused to obey God, and all those persons who have abused God's people who are trying to obey God's will in fact pay for what they've done. And that's what the point of the passage here is. God will judge those who have abused God's people, and God will judge those who have not listened to what God's people have said, and they will suffer for what they have done. That brings us to a description of the New Jerusalem, which I find to be fascinating. Again, describing this New Jerusalem, this new city of God, as opposed to the whore of Babylon. This is the bride of Christ, the New Jerusalem. And you can tell that the author is trying to describe here the indescribable. And so what he does is talk about all kinds of jewels and the like that are going to constitute this new city. But it goes on, then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And in the spirit he carried me away to a great high mountain and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It has the glory of God and a radiance like a very rare jewel, like jasper, clear as crystal. It has a great high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and on the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites, and on the east 3 gates, on the north 3 gates, and the south 3 gates, and on the west 3 gates, and on the wall of the city is 12 foundations, and on them are the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. He goes on to talk about the dimensions of this new Jerusalem. And again, these are sort of dimensions that to the ancients would have a hard time grasping. The author's trying to describe the indescribable, and so he describes something that is really hard for an ancient mind to wrap their heads around. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies foursquare, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with its rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which the angel was using. So according to this description, the New Jerusalem is this huge cube. It's a cube that is 1,500 feet wide, 1,500 feet tall, and 1,500 miles wide, 1,500 miles tall, 1,500 miles wide. Just to give you an idea of what the size of that is, I love this picture here that shows you sort of the footprint of the New Jerusalem on North America. And you can see just how large this would be if something is 1,500 miles wide and 1,500 miles deep, and then 1,500 miles high. So here's a picture, another picture I think is sort of a clever picture that shows you what that would look like. That's what the what the New Jerusalem would look like according to Revelation 21:16. It is in fact 1,200 stadia. 12,000 stadia in all directions, which is approximately 1,500 miles. So it is about, as people have estimated, it's about 2 million square miles, and it would be larger than all of India. And if you allow for 12 feet per story, this would be a city that would have something like 600,000 floors. 600,000 stories to it. So it's just beyond imagination. It's just too big for an ancient mind to understand, but that's the whole point. This is beyond description. This is beyond description. It does, though, I think, interestingly enough, when you look at this the size of the city, and you look at this imposed on the Mediterranean world, it's interesting that the footprint would extend basically from Jerusalem on one end to Rome on the other end. This distance, as the crow flies, is about 1,400 miles. So it's about 1,500 miles in each direction. So you can see that this encompasses basically what the ancients would have understood as the known world. This was the area where most civilization was, that most ancients who would be reading this text would be familiar with. A vast, vast city. But the description of the city, I think, is fascinating too. It's not only the size of the city that is sort of awe-inspiring. If you look at the city, it's all made of jewels and gold and the like. And the description is really fascinating. The wall is built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass. Well, if it's gold, it wouldn't be clear as glass, but that again is one of those contradictory images. The foundations of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the fifth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl, and the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. Again, it's an image that is just something you can't take in. This would be more magnificent and so awe-inspiring that you could not possibly use human words to describe it. You have to use these images, these images of just incredible beauty and richness and wealth and the like. This is an incredible, incredible city, unlike any city that anyone on earth has ever seen. But what I find most interesting about the description in the Jerusalem is what it lacks. And so the next passage in 21:22, it says, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. In other words, God's presence is there. You don't need a temple to go and try and find God's presence. God's presence is in the city. God is in the city along with the Lamb. So there's no need to have a temple. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. Nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. For its entire life, Israel has been paying tribute to other nations. All of its glory, all of its financial resources have gone to other nations. And now in this vision of the end, nations will in fact bring their glory into this new Jerusalem. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. You used to shut the gates at night because you were afraid of robbers and other evildoers that might get into the city at night. So you locked up the doors. Well, there's no evil in the world anymore, so there's no need for the gates ever to be locked, and there will be no night because there is the Lamb and the presence of the Lord God Almighty at all times. People will bring into it the glory and honor of the nations, but nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. Nothing unclean will enter it. In the ancient world, there was this view that cities attracted evil behavior. It attracted all manner of sordid behavior and thievery and the like. But there will be nothing unclean that will enter the New Jerusalem. No one who practices any abomination will be found in the city. This is going to be unlike any city that people at present are familiar with. It goes on to say, talk about the river of life. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, and with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month. I don't know if you're familiar with the Harry and David Fruit of the Month Club, where you get a different fruit each of the 12 months of the year, a box of really nice fruit from Harry and David. Well, Harry and David didn't invent that. Here, according to the book of Revelation, the tree of life does exactly that. Each month, the tree of life bears a different fruit. So each month, we have a different fruit produced by the tree of life. It's a fruit of the month club in and of itself. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So not only the fruit, but even the leaves bring about healing. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it. His servants will worship him. They'll see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and there will be no more night. They need no light or lamp or sun, for the Lord their God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. They will finally see God face to face, and they will not die when they see God face to face. He will know their name, and they will know his name. They will know God on a first name basis in the New Jerusalem. And then he said to me, these words are trustworthy and true for the Lord God, for the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. See, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. These are the words, trustworthy and true. The Lord God, the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place. See, I am coming soon. Blessed is the one who keeps the words of the prophecy of this book. How do you keep the words of the prophecy of this book? By remaining faithful at the present time in spite of opposition, in spite of the fact that it may cost you your life. And then we get to the epilogue. This is the very end of the book, starting in verse 8 of chapter 22. I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, you must not do that. I'm a fellow servant with you and your comrades, the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God. Then he said to me, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near. Let the evildoer still do evil, and the filthy still be filthy, and the righteous still do right, and the holy still be holy. See, I'm coming soon. My reward is with me to repay according to everyone's work. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. It's often the case in Hebrew writing in particular that when a prophet is given certain information, he is told information about the future, the prophet is told to seal up the words of the prophecy and open it at a later time when it's closer to fulfillment. In this case, the author is told not to seal up the book of the prophecy, the words of the prophecy of this book, because the time is near. And so, even though the time is near, let everyone continue doing what they're doing. The evildoers still do evil, the filthy still be filthy. Whereas the righteous are still supposed to do right, and the holy are still supposed to be holy. And I will come soon, according to this passage, says Jesus, and I will repay everyone according to one's work. And then we get the benediction. Blessed are those who wash their robes so that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates. Outside are the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. It is I, Jesus, who sent my angel to you with this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. The Spirit and the bride say, come. And let everyone who hears say, come. And let everyone who is thirsty come. Let anyone who wishes take the water of life as a gift. And then we get to a final passage in the book of Revelation that always makes me smile because of the Reader's Digest Bible. I've talked about this in other classes, so I'm sorry for repeating myself if you've heard this before, but the Reader's Digest people, and my students really have no idea what the Reader's Digest is, but at one time the Reader's Digest was incredibly popular writing. And the Reader's Digest people realized that there was a lot of money to be made in a condensed version of the Bible. The Bible is the great unread classic, and everyone had a copy of it. No one ever read it, though. And so if you could make a readable Bible, maybe people would buy it. So the Digest people put their condensing team together and came up with a Bible that was the condensed version of the Bible. And they called it the Reader's Digest Bible. Now, the way to condense the Bible, you can automatically get rid of some things. And what they did was get rid of all genealogies. For instance, whoever reads genealogies, everyone skips over those. So just get rid of all of those, and that shortens it considerably. There are 150 Psalms. Does anyone really remember 150 of them? So why not get rid of 2/3 of them and not number them? And then you'll have a Psalter that is much shorter, but still gets at the essence of what the Psalter is all about. And then you can condense poetry and do some other things like that. The Gospels are sort of repetitive, so you really have to have all three of them and they're full text. And so you shrink down each of the books and you end up getting a condensed Bible into something called the Reader's Digest Bible. It was condensed by the Revised Standard, it was a condensed version of the Revised Standard Version that was being done at the time that the new Revised Standard Version was being produced. So this was the older version of the RSV Bible, as opposed to the NRSV Bible that was being done at the same time. Well, this was a complete bust. People did not buy this. You still can buy it on eBay. Actually, it's on eBay if you're interested in it. It's get it for a pretty good price, because it's fascinating to sort of look at and see what they've done to condense the Bible. But after all of their work, they got to Revelation chapter 22, the very, very end of the last page of the Bible. And here's the passage that they ran into in Revelation chapter 22, Revelation 22, 17 to 21. The Spirit and the bride say, "Come." Let him who hears say, "Come." Let him who is thirsty come. Let him who desires take the water of life without price. That's what I just read. But here's the next part. I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues described in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the prophecy of this book, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. Well, the condensers get to this point and they've taken away a lot of the words of the book of this prophecy and a lot of other prophecies in the Bible as well. What are they supposed to do? How do you condense this in a condensed version of the Bible? Well, if you look carefully at the Reader's Digest Bible, you'll see their solution to this was simply to omit that passage. Rather than try to condense it, they just omitted it, knowing that no one would ever be aware of that passage, which is in the final paragraph of the New Testament. I find that to be fascinating. Anyhow, let's talk about what is unique about the book of Revelation, and then how the book of Revelation falls into or picks up on important ideas elsewhere in the New Testament, because I think two of these are both really important things to point out. First of all, one of the unique things about the book of Revelation is this idea of the two resurrections. We just read a passage that talked about that two resurrections, where there is supposed to be a first resurrection, where the martyred are going to be raised, and they're the ones that are going to rule for 1,000 years. So there is that resurrection before the 1,000-year reign. And then there is a second resurrection after that 1,000-year reign that takes place on the day of judgment. And that's when everyone else is raised from the dead. So the martyred are raised first. They reign for 1,000 years, and then you have a second resurrection where the rest are raised. This is the only book in the New Testament that talks about two resurrections. And it seems to me that this is very much related to the context, the historical context of the work, that the author's trying to say that those martyrs are going to be treated in a special way. And their special way is going to be this special resurrection where they're going to get to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. No one else gets to do that. The rest will be raised, and the rest will be with God forever and all of that. That's not to take away from them. But those who are martyred are going to be treated in an even more special way. So that is a unique feature of the book of Revelation. You don't find that elsewhere in the New Testament. You also don't find this notion related to the two resurrections, this notion of the millennium, that there is a 1,000-year period of reign of the martyrs and Christ. A 1,000-year reign is not found elsewhere in the New Testament either. So those are two very, very distinctive features of the book of Revelation that make it quite unique in the New Testament, and in fact are quite different as a result than what is traditional New Testament thinking. The other thing is unique about the book of Revelation, but also related to the historical circumstance of the book. And I mentioned this earlier in our study, and that is the emphasis on the vengeance of God. You do not find emphasis on God's mercy or God's grace in the book of Revelation. We saw these passages that talk about God judging you based on what you've done. These notions, sort of a works righteousness kind of attitude, is a way of interpreting that, but a better way of understanding it is that those who hurt God's people will pay. And that's really what the vengeance is about in the book of Revelation. If you mess with God's people, you do so at your own risk. You will pay. God will remember your punishment, your abuse, your murder of God's people. You will pay the price for doing that. And in that regard, the book of Revelation really wants to emphasize the justice of God. God can be trusted to repay people for the injustice they have committed. And again, that's an important message for people who are being called upon to lay down their lives, to know that their lives are going to be avenged. Their deaths are going to be avenged, that their persecutors are going to pay for what they've done. All of that would be a source of hope to those who are reading this in the first century, rather than something that is doom or something that is causing them terror. That would be a message of assurance to people in the throes of persecution. But there are other things besides those uniquenesses. There are other things I think that people overlook in the book of Revelation that are really quite standard fare and emphasize, even though they do it, it does it in a slightly different way, it still emphasizes ideas that you find elsewhere in the New Testament. And I just want to list these very quickly, because I do think it's really important to understand that the book of Revelation, as all writings of the New Testament, tell you that following Christ comes at a cost. This is not a child's game. This is serious business. And if you follow Christ, you may end up suffering. And that may be physical suffering, but it may cost you in other ways as well. Following Christ costs. It costs the follower. There is a cost to discipleship. And the book of Revelation emphasizes that. That's not alone, though, in the New Testament. You see that also everywhere in the New Testament. You see that in Matthew's gospel. You see it in James. You see it in Paul's writings. You see it all over the New Testament as well. You also see that in the book of Revelation, this idea of following Jesus is not something that is a 25% commitment. It is a total commitment. This is not something that is supposed to be a hobby. This is supposed to be a life commitment. This is a total commitment. And that too is something that other writers of the New Testament want to emphasize. Following Christ is a total commitment. And it is required of all believers to be totally committed. And so in the book of Revelation, if you're not totally committed, then you're not committed at all. You're not in the camp. There are no fence straddlers, as I said in the book of Revelation. So your commitment is either totally to Christ or else you're in the other camp. That, though, is not unique to the book of Revelation. That same kind of emphasis on total commitment is seen elsewhere in the New Testament as well. But another thing I think that's really important to point out is that the book of Revelation shows us that the death and resurrection of Jesus is not just some kind of past event that is sort of nice for us to sit around and reminisce about. The simple fact of the matter is that the New Testament wants to say that the death and resurrection of Jesus have cosmic implications. Cosmic implications. The death and resurrection is not the ultimate victory of God, but the death and resurrection of Jesus foreshadows what will be the ultimate victory of God, and that is the reclamation of all that God has created. God will create a new heaven and a new earth. So the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus is just the beginning of what is ultimately to be the triumph of God. And that is important to see in the book of Revelation, but you also see that in other writings. I always point that out when we study the book of Romans, for instance. Paul's epistle to the Romans. Paul has this notion that the death and resurrection has cosmic implications. Oh, shoot, what did I do here? Wait a second. And finally, I think another point that unmute. Okay, sorry. I'm messing around with things here and I touched the wrong button here. The other thing to point out, though, that the book of Revelation wants to emphasize that God wins. God ultimately triumphs. That God is going to defeat evil and injustice and death. That in fact, God ultimately triumphs. So the message is that you are playing on the right team, even though it does not appear that we're winning the game. We are on the right team, and God is ultimately going to win. That too is not something that is unique to the book of Revelation. He describes it in a unique way, but the message is not unique. Others too recognize this same ultimate triumph of God over the forces of death and evil. Evil will not have the last say. Death is not going to end. Death is not going to win ultimately. Death will die. Evil and injustice will be stamped out. God will triumph. And that's the message of the book of Revelation, and why I think the book of Revelation is really a message of hope and not a prophecy of doom. And with that, I see it is really 10 o'clock, and I guess I didn't really have a chance to ask if there were questions, but do people have some questions here as we spend a couple extra minutes maybe to answer any questions that all of you might have? Or are all of your heads spinning at this point?
I have a question.
Okay, question, great.
So John wrote this in the 1st century.
Correct.
And that's before they knew that there were planets that existed. I mean, what about the universe, and how does that enter into? I mean, this is all like Earth-based.
This is why Galileo had some real problems here and the like. Yeah, the church. The church. I mean, the Earth is in the middle of the universe, and everything revolves around the Earth, and like that's the biblical view. And it shows us one of the reasons why we have to be really careful that we understand this in its ancient context. We think very differently than the ancients did, and this three-tiered universe is a perfect example of that. Does that mean, even though they had a different understanding of the world, that the message of the book is not to be believed? In other words, God will triumph. Ultimately, when we get discouraged that we think evil and injustice and the like are winning, we've got to realize that in fact God is going to be the ultimate victor. Yes, other questions?
Anybody else?
You're all being so nice. I know you're being so nice. And you're gonna click off and say, what the heck has he been talking about for 6 weeks? What I think it's really important for you to read the book of Revelation and know something about it. I do not think it has as much benefit to us as some people would have you believe. I tell the story about when I first started studying the book of Revelation. I counted the number of times that the passage was read. Revelation was read in a 3-year period in our church, and it was read 9 times. Now, there are 4 lessons every Sunday for a 3-year period, 52 weeks of the year, 4 lessons. And there were 9 readings from the book of Revelation. And if you read those 9 readings, you saw that 4 of them were exactly the same passage. And other passages were read on Easter. And no one's going to preach on Revelation on Easter. I had a good friend in seminary whose minister, he was not a Presbyterian, but whose minister had been preaching on the book of Revelation for 17 years. Now, there's the difference, that on the one hand, we tend to be in a tradition that downplays, if not ignores, the book of Revelation. John Calvin, the spiritual grandfather of our denomination, wrote a commentary on every book of the New Testament but the book of Revelation. Other denominations, on the other hand, see this as the only book to read in the New Testament. I think both of those perspectives are wrong. You need to know more about the book of Revelation, but there are other books that probably are more helpful for your day-to-day life.
I have a question.
Oh, yes. Okay, Sally, yes.
How long after the death of Christ was this book written?
It's generally believed that Jesus would have died in about the year 30.
30,
This
okay.
this book would have been written in the early 90s.
It's amazing to me that the Christians were such a threat that soon after Christ's death, that they really were being persecuted to such an extent. This was a big movement. At least they interpreted it as a big enough movement to really crack down on them.
Well, they were good at nipping things in the bud.
Oh, okay.
And that's what I think they really were trying to do. They were trying to prevent it from getting out of hand. And it was starting to spread and grow. It was becoming far more visible. As long as you're a small group and you're not making waves and the like, then you can sort of fly under the radar. And Christians were getting to the point where they were successful enough to be on Rome's radar screen. And that became a problem for Christians because Christianity was an illegitimate religion.
Yeah.
And that's why you had to be really careful about what you said about Rome in your writings, but being aware of the fact that the persecution was being done by the forces of evil. This was a cosmic battle Christians were fighting. It wasn't just you and Rome. This is a battle between the forces of God and Satan, and you're caught in the middle of this.
Yeah. There was a passage where it talked earlier about being marked. The devil would have marked your head and your hand. Was that a practice that people were marked physically with any kind of mark on their forehead or their hand?
If you were a slave, you might have been marked, but
Okay.
free people tended not to be marked. But what I like about the mark on the forehead, and since I'm very sensitive about forehead, since I have a big one, putting a mark right on your forehead is something that everyone else can see.
Mm-hmm.
So as soon as you walk in the room, others know what team you're playing on, even though you may be unaware of it.
Yeah.
And that's what, there's a mark of the lamb and there's a mark of the beast. Both are marked. So which mark do you have on you?
Okay. Thank you.
Bill, do you have a...
But you made a comment earlier that if we don't understand the early thinking worldview, it makes it difficult to understand much of this chapter. I think it makes it difficult to understand anything of the Bible if we don't understand the worldview at the time, and we only read it and put our view into it. We always get a misinterpretation. Am I wrong in that?
No. And I spend a lot of time in my New Testament class talking about the cultural and historical background for the New Testament. There's a saying in New Testament studies that you can't understand what it means today until you understand what it meant in the past. So what did it mean originally? And that's what you do, what's called exegesis. You try and do this study to try and figure out what it would have meant to the first hearers or the readers of the book. And only then can you then apply that to today. Then you've got to translate that. What do I get in light of the meaning here? What is the payoff for today? And too often, when I taught in the prison, for instance, I'd do this historical background, and you could tell all these guys' eyes would glass over and the like. And I had to keep reminding them, you can't know today. You can't be so interested in what it means today without doing the work of trying to figure out what it meant in the past. That's really essential work to do. So that is right, Bill. You can't understand any writing of the New Testament without understanding the cultural and historical world out of which these writings grew.
I have a question.
Okay, Patty.
I hesitate to ask this, but I just want to know for myself. You need a commitment to Jesus Christ. What is that saying to all other religions that don't believe in Jesus?
In the New Testament, they are really only interested in Christians versus non-Christians. So their understanding, Islam is going to come in, say, 700 years later. There are going to be other religions in the world that they know nothing about. But I find it interesting that people are offended by Christianity's exclusivism, when in fact, every religion is exclusive. Muslims don't say, well, you only need to be partly Muslim. They're not thinking about Christians. Muslims are supposed to be fully devoted to their religious tradition. In Judaism, you're supposed to be fully devoted to Judaism. Every religion makes an exclusive claim. Christianity is no different in that regard. And you'll never see a religion say, well, we have about 50% of the truth, so you can be sort of committed to us. But if you go down the street, that religion may be 40% committed there. No, everyone is 100% committed. And that's really what they're asking in the early church. Be committed to this faith. Other questions? I know we're going late, and I know your service is going to start soon, so I don't want to step on people's toes, but I do want to give you an opportunity, now that we've done everything, to ask some questions and get some more clarity about what we've covered. We have covered a tremendous amount, and I'm very impressed that you've stayed with me in all of this. This is very complicated stuff. As I say, I think the details are complicated. The overarching message is not as complicated. But the details of the story get to be a little bit confusing.
Makes me wonder how much of this is supposed to be literal, especially this week. If you know what I mean.
What do you mean this week?
Well, I guess it just seems almost, I hate to say it this way, but it almost seems like fantasy type stuff here that you might see. But how much is this really? And I'm looking at the symbolism then also.
Yeah, I mean, the book is wrong. It didn't happen soon. So the basic point is that this was supposed, you don't tell people who are in the midst of suffering, well, maybe this will come to pass in 3,000 years. That's no message of comfort at all to someone who's dying for the faith. It's the message over and over again is that this is to take place soon, and it didn't happen. So the book itself is fundamentally wrong about the timing of this. But is the book wrong about God's ultimate victory? The sort of the big question that it's asking. And I would say no, that is in fact the Christian hope, that God will end up succeeding. And that God's mercy, as to go back to other questions, the question, for instance, that Patty answered or asked, God's mercy, I think, will extend to all, that God is in the business of recreating, that God is going to recreate what in fact God has created. And that's the ultimate picture that we see. Jesus' resurrection from the dead secures the final victory of God. And the final victory of God will be the defeat of evil and death and injustice. And
that's good. You can cut through the symbolism and see the overall message.
I think that's really important in looking at this, because you can get caught up, as you say, in literalism and what does this particular detail mean? How does it apply to today? That's not the way to look at it. Again, it's like a painting. It's a graphic. This is graphic art, and what you need to do is pull back from it and sort of get the overall effect rather than look at the individual brush strokes. What's the overall effect that you're getting from this particular writing? And that is a message of hope, and a message that we're playing on the right team, and therefore our commitment will be honored. But our commitment is going to be honored. God will show himself. We know God to be merciful, and we trust that God is going to extend his mercy. In light of having received it ourselves, we then extend it to others as well.
Okay. Anybody else?
It's been great, people. I really, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate your bearing with me, and it's so fun to see all your faces. It's so, well, it's been really a lot of fun. So it's always great to be at the Derry Presbyterian Church. I've done it now for something like 20 years. But it's great. It's great. So thank you so much for your attention for 6 weeks on very difficult material. But are there any other final questions that anyone has?
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Buzz.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Okay,
Buzz.
people.
Nice
Thank
nice
you.
to see everybody without their mask on, right?
No, it's great. And I was telling Jack earlier, I teach with, when I'm in person, I've got to teach with a mask on, standing behind a plexiglass barrier, and I teach students with masks on too. So I don't know who I'm teaching this semester. I can sort of tell the males from females, but I have no idea who's in my class. It is the most bizarre, and everyone wants in-person classes. I guess there's a beauty to in-person classes, but I just don't know who I'm teaching. When I'm online, I actually get to see faces, and that's really nice to be able to have that kind of interaction, which I don't have when I'm in a classroom.
Buzz,
Okay.
to resolve that,
No, what?
at the museum, we wear a big 5x7 photograph around our neck so people can see what we look like without the mask on.
Oh, that's a good idea. But I've realized that I can't tell people from their eyebrows up. I'm really having a really hard time sort of, negotiating this part, and even students I've had in past semesters are in my class, and I have no idea who they are. And then when they talk, they're speaking through a mask, so you can't hear them properly. I have none of the cues that I had before to identify any of my students this semester. It is really, really a challenge. So this actually is nice when you are online, even though you're not in the same room, you actually have the ability to look at one another. And that is really a lot easier to teach when you're looking at people.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you all. Great
Thank you,
seeing
Buzz.
all of you. Have a
Yeah.
great day. Hope to
you.
see you next year.
All right. Thanks. Yeah, thanks
You
so
do
much.
too.
Take
Okay.
care.
Bye
Okay,
now.
bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.